Helen said she would not be able to make it today.
Okay. Before we, since we're going to be on TV, make sure everybody has a mic accessible to them when it's on speaking. Everybody does? You guys can share over there? Good? Okay. Great. Okay. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
We're going to go ahead and call the meeting to order. Noting all board members are present, with the exception of Council President Hudson, who is excused. And as the first order of business, I will entertain a motion to accept the minutes from the August 23rd, 2018 meeting.
So moved.
Second.
Any further discussion? Corrections? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Carried. Okay, Joe, report from the Secretary.
Yes, good morning. We have some new correspondence from Mr. Giardine in your packet. And we're planning to go ahead with the Tranche 2 financing this fall. There'll be a series of resolutions coming first to the school board, then to this body. I believe there's been one already in progress for the next school board meeting. And tied into that is our approval today of the State Environmental Quality Review Act for each of these projects, which has to be a precursor to the financing.
Right.
And that completes my report.
Okay. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you.
Next up, we have a report from our program manager. Chris, welcome.
Morning. How's everyone?
Doing great. Thanks. Let's see. It looks like the mic, I don't know why that podium is there, but the mic is, so you can either bring the mic closer or the podium closer.
Love that. We'll slide this guy up. It's
All
nice
right.
to have the podium. You hear me now?
You can hear
Everybody
you.
with me?
Thank
All
you.
right. Good morning. So you have in front of you the report. I was going to just highlight a few things in there as we do. Under in the upper right-hand corner, start in the upper right-hand corner under bids procurement, just to draw attention to the fact that we now have a contract in place for Fowler and Blodgett. Those were signed and approved. Just a note on Fowler that that's for the roof portion only. Fowler basically has three components. There's the roof, the interior renovations, and the site work. So this contract was for the roof only. So, and then Blodgett, the contract has been issued. Corcoran, we anticipate, I put that down as bidding that in November and December. We're actually have been into SED for that, and we're in the process of getting approvals in place for that and anticipate that really shortly. We've gone a couple rounds with an addendum to answer questions that they had, and should have that back and finalized very shortly. Under financing, I think Joe mentioned before, over the course of the next 3 months, October, November, and December, we'll be obtaining, the resolutions required for the permanent financing from JSCB, from the school board, and from Common Council. Will occur at a series of meetings over the next 3 months, so that we're in a position by the first quarter of 19 to get permanent financing in place for the first two buildings, for Corcoran and Nottingham, which will be the first two that we procure.
Okay.
Any questions on that? Okay. Under design and approval status, we've been to SED on Clary, Corcoran, Danforth, and Elms. We're currently out there today for a review on Nottingham, and then our last one will be for Henniger, and that's scheduled for the 28th of October. So, and we're progressing well with, we go out, they review the plans, we do a face-to-face sit-down, they ask questions, we respond to the questions in the form of an addendum, and then they review the addendum. Sometimes we go 2 rounds to answer furthering questions, and sometimes they approve after that. The intent, though, is that we have all of the Tranche 2 projects approved by the end of this year, is our intent. And that'll put us in a position to then start the procurement, and we have that planned out. Under schedule update, just work continues. Ed Smith, Bellevue, Grant, and Huntington. Work is continuing on all those buildings. Obviously, Grant and Huntington are occupied, so our work hours there are a bit different than they will be at Bellevue or at Smith in terms of when we're working and how we're working. And we worked through some schedules there to accommodate and not mitigate the disruption. I won't say eliminate disruption, but eliminate disruption in terms of the work that we're doing. Particularly at Huntington, our goal there is that by the end of October we have the bus loop restored to a usable condition, or not, that they can use that, not necessarily final plantings and everything is in place, but into a usable position is what we're aiming for. Okay. Any questions on any of that in terms of those buildings? move along. Under tranche 2, as I said, under design in the lower left, we're just, all the tranche 2 buildings, our anticipation is we have SED approval by the end of 18. And then in the center, just the under critical constraints, we have a schedule now, a procurement schedule that lays out the series of bidding all of the tranche 2 buildings over this quarter and the first 2 quarters of 19 we move into. So that'll be ongoing. And we've designed that such that we have a kind of a staggered flow in terms of when we bid, so we're not putting a ton of work out all at the same time, hopefully to maximize that competition or encourage the competition and enable bidders to see whether they are in a position of award for one of them, so they know whether they can bid on the next one. So that'll be happening. We're waiting, one piece that we are waiting on is just some response from Office of State Comptroller with respect to resubmission of the comprehensive plan and what that will require. So there's questions out to them. They've had some dialogue, and so we're in that process. We'll need that obviously before we move into the permanent financing component. So Fowler site redesign, I think at the last meeting you asked that I kind of provide a bit of a better update in terms of where we stand with that, so I was going to kind of step you through. The test results that we have, the specialty tests there that were in the lab, we're anticipating those back next week to have the results back. And once we have those, then our geotechnical engineer is going to analyze those and come up with a report. Our hope is that there's no surprises there. Our hope is that, because he kind of interpolated what he anticipates there, but we needed to validate that. So once we have that.
Those were like soil borings?
Soil borings, yep, where they take samples of that, and then they put compression tests on them, and then through those tests they can interpolate the rate of settlement and the amount of settlement, and so he wants that to validate the design that he's developed for that area. So our anticipation is that we have that report back from Stopin is the entity that's providing that for us by mid-October. And then the design, provided, like I said, that we don't have any surprises in that, the design would advance from November through December. And but between that period, we are going to go back out to state ed. The week of the 15th is the tentative for that, to have a conversation with them regarding MCA, because we are still, even with this revised design, going to exceed the allowable or available allowance for the incidental cost. So we want to go out and have a furthering conversation with them so that they understand what we're up against, and I've had some conversation with them. So, and their focus is to really understand what's atypical about what we're doing in terms of the conditions. So,
and again, just a standing offer to you and to Jaime as you move towards that meeting. If there's anything that my office can do, or others in the community, please let us know.
Appreciate that, and we'll keep you posted. This will be an initial to have a conversation, and we'll see what comes out of that. So.
Okay.
Chris, before you move on, the vendor, is that the first vendor who was looking at, who offered a proposal on that site, or is this the second vendor?
We bid the job just once.
I thought we had an estimate, and the estimate was high, and we were looking at someone else to offer a different perspective. So when, for example, we were talking about filling it at one point, and you're or remediating all of it, and then the second option, I thought we were talking about filling. I thought it was two separate folks.
We do have two separate entities. We had the one that procured the first design, and then we took another look at it and engaged with a different geotechnical engineer.
Stopin is new to the equation,
Stopin
right?
is new to the equation.
Right.
And that design is fundamentally more of leave as much in the ground as we can and mitigate by compaction and compression on the surface, so that we mitigate the having to remove all that and hopefully avoid the old foundations and the contaminated soil. But that is the design that we're currently focused on and moving forward with.
And what's the MCA on athletic fields? Is it 50%? Is it 0?
Well, you have two allowances. Is probably the easier way to do that: a construction allowance and an incidental allowance. And it's a bit odd, but the state requires you to record the cost for site work under the incidental. So it's a portion thereof. I mean, if we were going to call it a portion, 20 to 25% is your incidental portion of your allowance. And it's just with the amount of work that we have to do over there for the site, it's greater than what you would typically do. And obviously then it causes us to bump into that allowance ceiling of what we can do.
and they won't allow a transfer, so the incidental costs on this, if another project came under, they won't allow you to?
They won't, not between buildings.
Okay.
Those allowances are calculated on a per building basis based on formulas that they have for that. So no, they won't. So that's why we want to go to them and talk to them about some dispensation, given the conditions that are there in the field, that we could get some relief on that. So, following that, just as in terms of just out loud, and this is the part where I'm a bit on a concept level of, you know, we'd have to do this preload piece, which would essentially be from April of 19 to the fall of 2020 in terms of that compression, because we've got to go out and do the work, and then we've got to go out there. We've got to go out and do the make-ready work, relocate the CSO line that's there, and then bring the stone in and then let it sit. So that's why that's going to take a while. And then following that, we would start construction spring of 2021, finishing spring of spring of 2021 and finishing spring of 2022. And I know that's a long time, and I know that you know, everybody wants to accelerate that as much as we can, and so we're working to that end. But right now, just to paint you the picture of where it stands currently, that's where it is. So, and that's what I had. Other questions?
If another entity paid for some of this just to expedite it, could it be reimbursed from the JSCB? If there was a faster way to get this done, just another source of revenue. So the school districts, you know, building funds.
Mm-hmm.
Could that be reimbursed once this work was done? Just trying to expedite the process.
I presume it. I don't want to. Probably a better served question for someone else than me in terms of whether that can happen. But I don't. I'll speak to the expedited component of it. I don't know that would expedite it. If we get to a point where the state is not willing to give us any dispensation or an increase of that allowance, and you had another funding source, that could be something that would be helpful. But I don't know that another funding source would necessarily accelerate anything at the moment. Does that answer your question, Kelvin?
It does.
Okay.
I think staff has looked at this in part, and one of the plans being discussed is to issue a bond anticipation note prior to the permanent financing so that the work could get underway at Fowler next spring.
But regardless, you still have a wait time on this compaction.
Right. Correct.
Piece, right?
Correct.
That, regardless of dollars, that doesn't change.
Right now, we anticipate that to be about 12 months. But again, that's one of the things that we want validated from the geotechnical report that we're going to get back to kind of validate that, how much that will compress and how long it will take.
Chris, I don't have a question, but I do have a comment that during my visit to the schools, I've been checking the work that is being done, and I'm very concerned about some of the work that took place at Fraser and some of the work that is taking place at Grant. I mean, I'm an educator, but I grew up with a father who was a mason and all that, and from what I've seen, I'm not very pleased with the work that is taking place at Grant Middle School.
Yeah, no, there's definitely some things that we need to have addressed, and we are addressing, Jaime, that have been noted and will be identified for corrective action, and you know, be happy to provide. I think that's something that's kind of a work in the progress, and we're trying to figure out a few things at Grant in terms of what the solution is on some of the items, but be happy to provide an update on that once we've defined what it is that's deficient and what we want to have done.
Yeah, and I think that would be great for the entire board because, you know, at the end, they're going to be looking at us.
Yeah.
We're the ones that are approving the money, so.
There's no question that when you get to, we had a very eventful summer. We had labor was definitely an interesting factor this summer, and when you get to the end, things go fast and not always the way we want them to. So, but we'll make it right.
Thank you.
So Chris, my question is sort of a piggyback to Jaime's question. You had that as one of the constraints or critical issues when you discovered some of the conditions that Grant has, adversely impacted the schedule.
Yeah.
So is what Superintendent Alicea speaking about, is that
No, I don't believe so. I think his concerns are the same as our concerns. There's some quality issues of some of the work that was put in place that needs correction.
Gotcha.
But the discovered condition part is Grant, yes. Ed Smith, yes. I mean, some of the older buildings, when we start opening up walls and we find some things that we didn't anticipate. To speak to Grant specifically, we're taking that precast stone off of the building, and some of the conditions that we found of that wall, the backup wall behind that precast, is different than anticipated. It's got a lot of openings in it, a lot of voids in it that were greater than what we anticipated. So a little bit of a regroup there in terms of how we address that condition on the outside of the building. The interior portion of it, the library, when we pulled the library open, there was a few things in there that were a little bit different than anticipated, and we're changing the design slightly in there. So and that's a part of any project typically, is once you get into the demo phase, that typically reveals a few things that you didn't anticipate.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Chris, the timeline that you laid out, and understanding things are changing regularly on Fowler, is that anywhere in our packet here? And if not, is that something that you can provide?
It isn't, but I could give you a kind of a micro schedule.
That'd be
from
helpful.
50,000 feet to give you that, to lay that out. We have it.
Thanks.
So, did you to distribute that to everybody? Or?
Please, yeah. Just we get asked about it regularly. And
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's a Gantt form of chart, but
Understood.
I promise you there isn't 150 line activities in it. You know, we boiled it down to about 6 so that you can kind of see that.
Great, thank you.
Yep. Anything else?
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
All right. Next up, we have a report on our financial statements.
Good morning.
Morning.
We have this morning the July financial statements for JSCB, and there really was not a lot of activity, but some of the highlights were that we had disbursements that were approved by the board in June, and also we did have some interest income on investments. One thing I do want to mention, though, we do have auditors coming in the next few weeks to start auditing the JSCB, and we're hoping to have that completed and then the possible presentation sometime in November. So with that being said, I'm going to start down on page 5, if you're following along with me, and the first report will be the statement of net position. At the end of the July, we currently had $127 million of Phase 1 and Phase 2 cash. Also is included as capital assets of $152.3 million. As always, and I don't think we've had a end of June here with this full board, but at the end of June, usually there's a transition that goes from, we start a new fiscal year in July. So some of the numbers on this page will be updated after the audit's been prepared and the financial statements are done. So I just wanted to mention that the capital assets will be updated when the audit is complete at year end, along with the premium on bonds payable. And that's the only 2 items on this page. So compared to June, cash has decreased by $1 million due to the payments for project cost and increased by $131,000 for investment income on interest. So we're looking at a total net position of $51.2 million at the end of July. On page 6, this report shows the capital outlay and also what comes in to Phase 1 and Phase 2. You'll notice here Phase 1 is very lean. We will see very little activity going on from this point forward with Phase 1. All the contracts are closed. The only thing that you'll see coming up in the future will be debt service payments, and state aid intercept will flow through Phase 1 for debt service payments. Also, for Phase 2, as I mentioned before, you'll see here the earnings on investments was $131,000, and the capital outlay for payment applications was $1 million for the month of July. On page 7, this is the cash flow statement, and in July it shows the actual dollars. that came in and was spent. As I said, this is the beginning of a fiscal year, so we're only going to see the actuals for July and the projection for the rest of the year all the way out to June of 2019. As I said before, the sources was the interest income as well as the payments. So we're looking at, with the projections, the way they're going, we're looking at the approximately $59 million left in cash at the end of July in 2019. I'm sorry, at the end of June in 2019. And on page 8, we have the sources of expenditures from inception to date. And this shows phase 1 and phase 2 together. We have approximately, let's see, we have, phase 1, $144 million in sources, $132 million in phase 2, and a total of $141 million in expenditures for phase 1, and a total of $15 million for expenditures in phase 2. And again, as I said, this is up to the end of July. And does anybody have any questions? No? Okay. The next person on the agenda is our financial advisors. And we are lucky to have them in the room today from Raymond James. They came in from New York today. We have Kojo Asaidu, and we have Stephanie Lam. And Kojo's going to come up and talk to you a little bit about our upcoming borrowings. Okay, we want to get you start thinking about the fact that we are going to start asking for you to approve us to borrow money. And they are our underwriters, and they're the integral part in the bond issuance. They head up our team. We have a great financial team, and they're always looking for ways for us to save money. So they will also address your question about the cost of issuance. So with that,
Hey, Donna, before you do that.
Kojo, yes.
So the auditors are done?
No, they're going to start in the next few weeks. Mm-hmm.
When will they be done?
They should be done by the end of October, and hopefully we'll have a financial statement prepared and presented to the board sometime in November, usually, well, at the November meeting.
So they'll come here and
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Donna.
Thank you, Donna.
Welcome.
Thank you. Before I start, I want to make a slight modification to our role. We are required by regulators to make a distinction between financial advisor and underwriter. As of about 3 years ago, we're not supposed to call ourselves financial advisor anymore. We are supposed to identify ourselves as an underwriter for the financing. So,
Got it.
all right, so my name is Kojo Asiedo. I'm a public finance banker at Raymond James. The last time I was here, I came with Susan Smelsa, who discussed the finance plan for the Phase 2 projects. Susan has since retired from public finance, and I've taken on a lead role in the financing of the remaining projects for the school district. I'm very intimately familiar with the JSCB. I worked with Susan in putting together a proposal for the underwriter RFP that came out, I think, in 2014. And I also worked with her in putting together a financial plan that the state approved in terms of what is required by the legislation, where the state has to be involved in approving what the projects are going to be for the financing. I'm here with Stephanie Lam, who is a public finance banker with me at Raymond James. Stephanie has about 13 years, so 12 to 13 years of experience in public finance. Stephanie and I together cover local issuers in the state. She most recently did a $580 million transaction for about 56 school districts. So we're familiar with how school district financings work in the state, and we're very excited to apply our knowledge in helping the JSCB accomplish its goals. What we wanted to do today is go through very briefly how the first tranche that we did earlier this year went, and then address some ideas we have with respect to the next financings that, the tranche 2 financings that we have. And I think we sent some slides that were going to be projected, but looks like we're going to go the old school way and just look at the books that we brought. So if you turn to page 2.
Where are we, up here?
Okay. What page 2 does is go through very quickly how well the bonds that we offer to investors were received. So in tranche 1A, the JSCB was interested in selling just under 67 million of bonds, but we ended up receiving 406 million of orders. Similarly, for tranche 1B, we were interested in selling about 40 million, but we ended up getting orders for about 248 million of bonds. What that means is that for each dollar that the JSCB was interested in borrowing, investors were willing to lend about $6. And that helps in terms of reducing the cost of capital. So for both of these transactions, we ended up reducing the interest rate on the bonds by about 6 to 7 basis points, which translates to something like $300,000 of additional monies that we were able to transfer to the school. So the point that we wanted to make here is investors are very excited about the JSCB's borrowings, and the market changes, but we have no reason to believe that that excitement will not stay going forward. On page 3, we wanted to think a little bit about how we can apply the lessons we've learned in the previous transactions with the ultimate goal of maximizing the proceeds that are available for actually building the schools. There are two things, primary things that siphon money away from brick and mortar capital, and that's capitalized interest, which is the money that from the bond proceeds that we have to set aside to pay interest on the bonds before building aid starts coming into the school district. And then the cost of issuance, bond issuance cost, which is the money that we use to pay, legal, underwriting, credit, and administrative fees associated with issuing the bonds. And we'll go into a little bit more detail about each of these going forward. But the one thing is that if we could have fewer borrowings, we would reduce our cost of issuance. On the other hand, if we had fewer borrowings, we might be borrowing a little bit earlier than we need the money, which means that we're extending the time between when we're selling bonds to investors and when building aid is going to start coming in, which is going to increase the capitalized interest cost. So we've been kind of thinking about a number of ways to kind of avoid and limit these costs that end up getting siphoned out of the actual brick and mortar projects. And we've thought about a couple of things. We've always coordinated the borrowings that we do for the projects with the construction timeline. So we try to align our borrowings as closely to when the construction start date is going to be as possible. We are now talking with our desk to figure out whether investors are willing to give us some leeway with certain things that are traditionally done in municipal finance. So in this particular respect, we're looking at credit rating agencies. Typically, for a bond issue, investors are used to seeing that we get credit ratings, which is the equivalent of a credit score for the school district, from at least 3 different companies. And we've started having conversations with our salespeople and our underwriters to make sure to see whether we can get away with using just 2 of the 3, which would save $30,000 to $50,000. And every dollar I know is important, so we're trying to squeeze out as much as we can. And then we're also looking at applying some financing tools, forward transaction, which comes at a cost, but might help reduce cost of issuance and also address capitalized interest going forward. And I'll talk about this a little bit later. And as always, we want to maintain as much flexibility as possible and adjust our plans going forward, as things change, because this is a big project, and no doubt things will change going forward. So on page 4, we specifically want to address cost of issuance. For each of these financings, there are 2 components of cost of issuance. There are flat costs that you pay regardless of the size of the transaction. And then there are variable rate costs that depend on the size of the transaction. So the smaller a transaction is, the higher the flat cost component is going to be as a percentage of the total borrowing. But the variable rate borrowings go up and down with the size of the transaction. Traditionally in municipal finance, there are certain participants of the financing team that have flat fees. In this case, we have the bond issuer, the CITUS issuer, they have a flat fee structure. The state legislation also requires us to confirm that the pricing that we got on the bonds was the best that we could have gotten in the market at the time that we issued.
Just a quick question on the bond issuer fee. Am I correct that CITA cuts their fee, their typical fee, in half for JSCB bonds? Right?
That's my understanding, yes.
All right, just wanted to make that clear.
Right. The state requires us to verify that the prices that we're selling the bonds at is the best prices out there. And to do that, we have to go through the municipal bond bank and get them to get their FA to confirm that if we had issued the bonds through them, they would have gotten about the same yields that we ended up getting. To perform that service, they have a fee, and that fee is fixed, and they use a financial advisor to do those calculations, and they also charge a fixed fee.
Mayor, just reflecting on your comment, could we see that? So I asked for some of the closing costs because that's what I do, and just some of them didn't make sense. And when I didn't see a difference. I didn't see a breakdown with CIDA.
Right.
So it'd be great to see that, because on a lower borrowing, the closing costs were more than a higher, and he just explained that. But if we can disaggregate that data, it'd be helpful.
Yeah, I'll look to
Certainly at the next meeting.
staff to do that.
The breakdown, the detailed cost of issuance.
Sure. Yeah. That's what you're looking for, right?
Yeah,
Calvin?
absolutely.
Good.
And there are other participants that also charge fixed fees. A trustee who represents investors and makes payments directly by collecting building aid from the state and transferring them to bondholders who have invested in the school's projects. And trustees counsel, who's a who provides legal representation for the trustee. We also have the auditor and the printers. All of these are fixed fees. Now, on the other side, I'm not going to go through them because you're variable and depend on the size of the transaction, but there are variable costs. As underwriter, we get paid based on the size of the transaction. And the state also charges a bond issuance charge, which in this case is about $8 for every $1,000 that is borrowed. And that is also based, obviously, on the size of the transaction.
And I appreciate that, and you know, folks, the percentage I'm comfortable with. The ones where it's just it's a variable fee based on a dollar amount, it just doesn't make sense to me, because the work's the same. And in a lot of these instances, the work's no different, so I don't understand why something would cost more. If you have a percentage fee, that's fine, it makes sense to me. But in some of the others, it just seems, it appears that it could be just arbitrary. And I don't understand. I have 3 buildings I'm going to bond for. It's going to be $15 million. And the cost could be more than one that's 5. I just don't understand that. And again, now probably isn't the time to have that discussion, but it's certainly something I'd like to have a conversation with you and the fiscal team with the school district, try to understand that. So you don't know this, I do commercial lending, and the flat cost, variable cost makes sense, complete sense. I have a closing attorney, and the fee is the fee. Mm-hmm. You don't charge it based on the size of the transaction. The amount of work is the same. I close a loan for a low to moderate, because you could disadvantage. I close a loan for a low to moderate person, and they pay more than someone affluent. I'm just trying to wrap my head around that. So.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think part of some of this is just traditionally how deals have been done. The bond counsel always charges a fixed fee. Our counsel, we are represented by a counsel. We also agreed with them from the beginning to make it based on the amount of bonds that are borrowed. And by comparison, for example, the same counsel works on Rochester. They charge about $50,000 for every transaction. That's a fixed fee. But because of the way we did our arrangement with them, they ended up paying less. They ended up getting paid less on the most recent transaction. They ended up getting paid about $40,000 compared to the $50,000 that they would have been paid if they did Rochester. So there's some kind of economies of scale benefit of doing some variable rate transactions depending on the size of the transaction.
The whole point of this process is to look at all of that, right, and identify opportunities for savings. So it sounds like it's the right time to be looking at that, Calvin.
So moving on to page 5, what you're looking at on this page is just some scenarios that we're kind of currently contemplating. I mean, this might change, but this is basically a timeline of when different schools might be financed. So in scenario, we're comparing 3 scenarios here. And remember, the objective of what we're trying to figure out is whether it makes sense to do 3 borrowings and save on capitalized interest, or do 2 borrowings and save on cost of issuance. So we're looking at 3 scenarios here. In the first scenario, we are looking at financing Cochrane and Nottingham in March of 2019, and then Henninger in December of 2019, and then following that up in March of 2020, financing the remaining projects, Clary, Danforth, Elms, Shea, and Fowler. The alternative is to condense the financing into 2 financings. So we would have 2 borrowings for Cochrane and Nottingham in March of 2019, and then delay Henninger just by about a month, but then push everything up forward and do the financing for the rest of the projects in January of 2020. The cost here is obviously we're borrowing money a little bit earlier than we need, and therefore we ended up paying a little bit more capitalized interest. Then we looked at the third scenario, where we have two borrowings, but a component of the second borrowing is a forward. And what that means is that we will sell the bonds in December of 2019, but investors will not be required to wire the money for the project until March of 2020. There's a risk from the perspective of investors, because what happens if rates go up around that time? So because they're taking on that risk, they require a little bit of a compensation, and we'll go into that. In the current market, we're estimating that will be about 4 to 7 basis points for each month forward that we're requiring them to wait. On page 6, we kind of compare the different.
That third scenario, though, could increase cost back to the municipality, though.
Exactly. Yes.
So really, the rate risk is the investors. The investors are covered, though, by giving them those basis points.
Correct.
So the risk, the person who's going to assume the risk in that scenario, again, would be the municipality.
Right. But so actually on page 6, we kind of compare all the three, the three financing scenarios. So just going through each scenario again, remember what we're trying to do is minimize cost of issuance and capitalize interest. So in scenario 1, we have 3 borrowings, which means we have to pay an additional cost of issuance we're estimating about $365,000 in the current market. But because we don't have to issue the bonds earlier than we need, we save on capitalized interest. That's about $260,000. Again, rates change, and so we're several months ahead. We don't know actually exactly what the rates are going to be. In scenario 2, we end up saving on cost of issuance because we've just done 2 transactions, but we've borrowed earlier than we need, and therefore we've increased the capitalized interest cost. And that ends up being a net savings of about $100,000. In scenario 3, as you rightly mentioned, we're saving on both the cost of issuance and the capitalized interest, but investors are requiring a premium in order to allow us to borrow forward. We're thinking that's about 4 to 6 basis points for each month, 4 to 7 basis points for each month, and that is going to increase the cost of capital to the JSCB. But one of the things that's unique about this financing is, one, the state reimburses the JSCB at its cost of capital. So the state takes part of that incremental cost. We obviously don't want to leave the state paying more money than they need to pay, so we kind of went and made sure that this makes sense nevertheless. And what we found is that the additional 4 to 6 basis points that increases the overall payment during the building aid or repayment period increases debt service by about $500,000 for the JSCB. If you add that to the benefit that we're getting, we're saving about $365,000 in cost of issuance and about $260,000 in capitalized interest. Net scenario 3 is still better in the current market. Now, this assumes that we can actually sell the bonds with that 4 to 7 basis points. This is not going to be happening until December of 2019. Who knows where rates are going to be at that point. But what we're trying to do here is kind of lay out all the different options that might be available, so that in December of 2019, if we crunch the numbers and it actually does make sense, we'll give you all the scenarios that are available, and we can make a decision at that point whether it makes sense to pursue this. Because one of the things we need to think about is there's a 3-month space between the 2019 borrowing and the March 2020 borrowing. In that time period, what is the likelihood that rates would have actually increased? We can't say that right now. We know the Fed is increasing rates right now by about 25 basis points at each meeting. So if we're doing this deal, I probably feel more compelled to lock in the rate today than wait 3 months from now. But we don't know what the rate environment is going to be in December of 2019.
So you just answered, in a rising rate environment, this is a disadvantage, and a declining rate environment, it's advantageous to us.
Right, exactly. So what we are trying to do is just look at all the options that might be available, and as we get closer to the time of the actual financing, we will present some more ideas to you and give you actually actionable information that will help you make decisions based on what we should do going forward. And there are some benefits and considerations, and I'll turn over to Stephanie Lom to go take us through those.
Hi, good morning.
Morning.
Page 7 just has the 3 scenarios laid out, and it includes the benefits that Kojo spoke about, lowering the COI, lowering capitalized interest, and then the third benefit is mitigating that interest rate risk in a rising interest rate environment. Like Kojo was saying, if you borrow today, you're getting those rates today if you add that 4 to 6 basis point premium, you're taking a chance that in 4 months, rates are not higher than 16 to 24 basis points. Based on the recent interest rate patterns, that would be a good deal. Again, that's something that we'd have to look at in December of 2019 to figure out if it's worth taking on that extra cost with the understanding that we don't know where the market will be in 4 months. There's considerations like Kojo said, the additional cost, the interest rate risk, and then also there's certain termination provisions that us as underwriters include, and extra steps to make sure that we are not left on the hook at that March 2020 delivery date. So if you go to, let's see, page 8, this is another map of how the forward delivery transaction works. It's nothing really new on that page, but basically the marketing period has to be longer. The pre-closing period is the same, of about 1 to 2 weeks between pricing and the pre-closing. And then that post-closing period from December of 2019 to April 2020 is where the bonds have been issued but are not delivered. That's where we sign investor letters with certain forward investors to make sure that we believe that they're going to be around in 4 months. They're going to be available to take delivery of our bonds. We have to make sure that Raymond James is comfortable with that that scenario. So, this generally on an underwriters have outs that we can decide, we're not going to take delivery. That's rating downgrade, a change in financial condition, things that are basically focused on what the school district and the JSCB is doing. On a forward transaction, those outs are limited from the investor perspective, where they basically have to take the bonds unless the bonds are illegal or unless the tax status has changed. So when they sign an investor letter, they're basically saying, unless something totally changes, the world comes to an end, tax exempt bonds don't exist anymore, they're going to take those bonds. So the risk is really when the school district and the JSCB enter into a forward delivery with us, the risk is really on Raymond James as opposed to the school district. So that's why we take that extra step to get investor letters signed. And that's detailed more on page 9. Does anyone have any questions about it? I know it's a lot. That was a lot of information. Okay, thank you.
All set? Okay. Hey, so I guess I do have one question. So this is very helpful, and we appreciate. As you stated, we're trying to get every dollar available into the school building. So next steps, just talk us through those.
Sure. So what we're doing right now is running some of these ideas with a larger financing team to make sure that everything that we're thinking about here is contemplated in the legislation and we can actually do it.
Okay.
The person that has to sign, for example, the forward agreement is CIDA because they're officially the issuer of the bonds. Mm-hmm. So we need to make sure that they are comfortable with something like that and they're willing to do it. And we've already had preliminary conversations with their bond counsel to make sure that this is something that they're open to. Next steps, I think we're waiting to get final approvals from the state with respect to the projects. And once we get that and we have a sense of what the timing is going to be following that, we can start teeing up our team and setting up the financing so that we end up closing the bonds coterminously with when the project will actually start.
Good. Okay. All set? Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
We have several resolutions today,
Okay.
beginning with resolution number 61, which would be the monthly payment to Landon and Ryan.
Entertain a motion?
So moved.
Second?
Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Carried.
Resolution number 62 would be the monthly payment to the program manager.
So moved.
Second.
Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Carried.
Resolution number 63 would authorize payments to the various Tranche 1 contractors.
So moved.
Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Carried.
Resolution number 64 would authorize payments to the various Tranche 2 contractors.
So moved.
Any further discussion? All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Carried.
Resolution number 65 is a follow-up to our discussion at the last meeting. It is to authorize a 2-year contract extension with Landon and Ryan. Our discussions with them and between staff, we came up with a lump sum contract approach, which we thought is in the best interest of both parties. And the amount would be $35,020 per month for the 2-year period. And that would cover all the services that we anticipate needing.
I'd make the motion.
Okay. Have a motion?
Second?
Second.
Mayor, if
Discussion.
I would like to thank the staff, your team, as well as the school district's team, for making this happen. This body has been consistent about ensuring all of our vendors have an opportunity, and quite frankly, having the representative of the work being done reflect our community. And probably other than Turner and Chris, I personally have relied upon Landon and Ryan to help navigate the waters of the work that we're doing. This project is just so complex. So I'm happy to hear that there's a 2-year contract in place, and that they will be around to help continue to move this process forward.
Okay. Jaime?
I do have some questions, and because this is a contract, I don't think that we can discuss that in public about this. I would like to ask some other questions to the staff before we vote on this resolution.
Okay. Joe?
Are you requesting an executive session?
Yes, sir.
Okay. We have to, under the open meetings law, we have to be quite specific about the aspects of executive session for a contract, because the case law is such that just the general fact that we're considering a contract by itself is not eligible for executive session. But if you want to hear legal advice in regards to the contract terms,
I would like to get
if you could
legal advice regarding the contract.
so if that's a motion, we would need a second.
Second.
Okay. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? All right. Do y'all want to come downstairs?
If that's the best way to facilitate it.
I think so. Sure. All right.
Would we want to finish the rest of the
We could do that.
resolutions and then come back?
We can do that if
What-
that's
your
then
prerogative.
It'll be fine with me.
Okay. All right. So
we can hold this and move on to the.
just
the
to be
balance.
thorough, motion to go back into session.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Well, welcome back, everybody. Nice to see you all.
Remind folks, we are on TV, right?
We are. Okay, so we're skipping over resolution number 65-2018 and picking up with number 66. Joe, you want to talk us through that?
Yeah, so as I mentioned in my previous remarks, the state law and the bonding process requires this body to take a look at the environmental condition of each project as it proceeds, especially when we go into borrowing the money. And fortunately, typically with school reconstruction projects of this type, the environmental issues, while they're present, issues such as asbestos, etc., do not trigger major environmental questions that need what we would call a full environmental impact statement. So as a result of the architect's analysis of all of these 6 schools, and their paperwork is attached to the resolution, it's been determined that there's no significant impact on the environment, and therefore we can treat these as unlisted actions as a negative declaration, and we'll consider them each individually, with resolution number 66 being the negative declaration for the Clary Middle School.
And again, to be clear, these are all unlisted actions. Take them one by one.
Correct.
Starting with Clary. Okay, motion.
So moved.
Second.
Further discussion. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Carried.
Resolution number 67 would be the negative declaration for the Danforth Middle School.
So moved.
Second.
Any further discussion? All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Carried.
Resolution number 68 would be the negative declaration for the Expeditionary Learning Middle School.
So move.
Second.
Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Carried.
Resolution number 69 would be the negative declaration for Henniger High School.
So move.
Second?
Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Carried.
Resolution 70 would be the negative declaration for the Nottingham High School.
Second.
Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Carried.
And finally, resolution number 71 would be the negative declaration for Corcoran High School.
So move.
Second.
Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Carried. Entertain a motion to go into executive
So
session
move, Mayor.
for the purpose of seeking legal counsel on a contract.
Yes.
We have a second. Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, for those of you who are going to stick around, we'll be back.